This is Love Your Work. On this show, we help you find your unique signature as a creative entrepreneur. I'm David Cadavy. I've been a solopreneur for more than 10 years. I'm an international award-winning designer. I've written a couple best-selling books, Design for Hackers and Now the Heart to Start. From my closet in Colombia, I've interviewed titans of industry like Steve Case. I've interviewed best-selling authors like Seth Godin and James Altucher. I've interviewed experts on behavioral science, creators from dancers to a chef to a Hollywood set designer. I want to find out how each of them discovered what made them one in a million, and I bring those insights to you so you can find out what makes you one in a million too. If you are new here, welcome. Again, I'm David Cadavy. If you want to join us here on Love Your Work every Thursday, please hit subscribe on your podcast app and get my free creative productivity toolkit. Sign up at cadavy.net/tools. Now, you have heard about the importance of working with people who come from different perspectives. But will that automatically lead to great work? It's not so simple. Our guest today, Shane Snow, was curious about why diverse teams are supposedly so powerful when they're in fact very hard to pull off. That's why he wrote this new book. It's called Dream Teams. In his book, Shane really breaks down what makes a truly great team. How can you have just the right amount of conflict to have better ideas and go farther as a team without the relationships turning sour? So even though I work by myself, I really enjoyed this book. It's full of great stories of dream teams throughout history, and it really made me think about how to seek out differing perspectives in improving the work that I do. One way that I did that was through publishing The Heart to Start on Google Docs and taking edits from people, and I really got a lot of great insights from that. I also get great insights from those of you who email me about the show from time to time. In this conversation, Shane and I talk about, do we always have better ideas working with a team? What are the key components of making something great as a group? We also talk a lot about writing. How did Shane turn his curiosity for one subject into a marketable idea about dream teams? We also trade tips about how we do research for the books that we write. Hear exactly Shane and my different approaches to doing research and collecting ideas to write about. And a big thank you to our newest Patreon supporters. Our Patreon supporters help cover much of the production costs of bringing the show to you each week. Andrea Klunder started supporting. Andrea, not too long ago, had me as a guest on her podcast, which is called The Creative Imposter. If you've ever struggled with imposter syndrome, where you somehow don't feel like you've earned the right to do your creative work, I think you're going to really find that to be a really useful conversation. So go check out Andrea's podcast. John DeVore also joined as a Patreon supporter. I asked why it was that he chose to support. He said, because you're tackling a very hard problem, namely helping people to combine hard work and love, the fruits of which make life worth living. Maybe you're like John. If Love Your Work is helping you find that overlap in your love and money Venn diagram, if it's helping you find life to be worth living, if you want to see more of that in the world, if you want this show to stay in the world, I would really appreciate your support. You can do $3, $5, $10 a month. It all really helps bring this show to thousands of people, and it helps me keep doing this. So if you want to join Andrea and John, find me on Patreon at cadavy.net/donate. That is cadavy.net/donate. I want to be sure to formally thank all the new Patreon backers who have come through the past few weeks. I mentioned many of them in my latest update on my Colombian visa incident, but here they are again in an official intro. Thank you to our newest mini sponsor, Roxana Maynard, pledged at the $99 level, which really brings the monthly pledge level up. Roxana runs Agility Alchemist, which is a consultancy service for innovative retailers. Check them out at agilityalchemist.com. You'll be hearing them during the closing credits of the show. Thank you also to other new members, Mason Green, Stephen Carbaugh, Arm Sadaborn, John Mitchell, Cesar Pena, Jennifer Gardner of the Rome Howl podcast. Also thank you to Ray Miller, Matt Lacey, and Jeffrey Mason, all for raising their pledges. And thank you to David Junca for his one-time pledge. Some of these people specifically helped because of my sudden disruptions. Some people used it as an opportunity to do what they had been meaning to do all along, like Cesar Pena, who said my incident of getting kicked out of Colombia got him to stop procrastinating. Cesar also says that it's hard to pass by authentic content nowadays. That's great to hear, Cesar. Authentic content is what I'm trying to make, and monetizing authentic content in this world of personal data collection, fake news, and Cambridge Analytica scandals isn't so straightforward all the time. So that's why I really appreciate the support on Patreon. It's a solid way to incentivize authentic content. It helps me keep making the show. If you want to join Caesar and the couple dozen other supporters, we're now at 30 supporters. Go to kadavy.net/donate. That is kadavy.net/donate. By the way, you also might have seen the note I dropped in a couple of days ago about my newest book. It is another short read. This one is all about making money for your writing on the Steem blockchain. And in this world of data collection that I was just talking about, it's getting harder for writers to make money through honest and straightforward writing. But the Steem blockchain is one technology that might change that forever. Make money writing on the Steem blockchain is out right now on Kindle, paperback, and Audible. Check it out at kadavy.net/steembook. That's kadavy.net/STEEM book. I'm really excited to have Earth Class Mail as a sponsor. Earth Class Mail transforms the daily piles of mail, checks, invoices, and correspondence into digital documents that you can act upon. Their online tools help you identify checks and deposit them quickly and automatically with no trips to the bank, with available integrations into your accounting and billing systems. Earth Class Mail allows you to streamline, organize, and collaborate on all your documents so you can stop wasting time scanning documents. It's really amazing. Go to earthclassmail.com, and when you sign up, use the promo code LOVE. You're going to save 10% for 3 months, or you can tell a sales rep the promo code LOVE and get 8% off the already discounted yearly plan pricing. That's earthclassmail.com. Save with the promo code LOVE. Now, here is Shane Snow. And I'm here with Shane Snow, and I just read your fantastic book, Dream Teams. And I'm curious, what was it that got you so interested in Dream Teams?
Well, thank you. That's really flattering, first of all. There are a few things that kind of came together. It's a little bit of a natural outgrowth of my first book, which I wrote in 2014, which is about lateral thinking or approaching problems differently. And my observation that when you see breakthrough change in any industry in history, it's because someone, instead of playing the same game a little better, they changed the game. And one of the things that I observed kind of coming out of that and spending a few years working with companies, working on my own company, speaking about that, is that the thing that is almost always the case, I would dare say always the case when that happens, is different kinds of people have combined different ways of thinking. That it's not just some person who just magically thinks differently, that we make breakthroughs together. And so I became kind of fascinated by that idea. At the same time, I was running a company, it was growing, and I noticed that the bigger the team got, the more we slowed down, the more potential there was for problems. And I kind of had this question about, we have this promise that we're told that a great team is more than the sum of its parts. And you put the right people together and you can be infinite. And yet that never happens. It's like the more of you there are, even if you get along great, you don't add up 1 + 1 = 10. You add up 1 + 1 = 1.8. And some things require 1.8. So you do that. And yet there's examples in history and every once in a while in our own life where that is true. So I wondered, what's the difference? And it turns out that it actually comes back to that very same thing. And that's that my obsession for a few years kind of became about this, that when different heads come together, 2 heads are better than 1 if those heads are different in some cases, but 2 heads will destroy each other if they're different too. So there's this kind of great juicy paradox of humanity. And that became the exploration that became eventually this book.
Yeah, and myself as a solopreneur, I always feel like I want to do everything myself. I feel like that's the best way to have the best ideas and stuff. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of examples that counter that idea. But I mean, did you find anything to support this idea that sometimes the individual has better ideas?
Yes, absolutely. And writing is a very kind of lonely process, as you know. But when you really zoom out and when you especially when you take ego out of it, anything that you're writing about is about other people. Anything that you're writing about is building on the work that's already been done. And great writing really needs critiques. It needs editing. It needs a lot of different, a diversity of inputs in order to become, better than something normal. And so there is that, but yet there's great research that shows, for example, when people get put in a room and told to shout as loud as they can, that in a group of 6, you'll shout about 74% as loud as you will by yourself. And when you're put on a tug of war rope, you'll pull a little less hard when you're in a group than when you're by yourself. And so some people will say, oh, well, that's social loafing. People are slacking off. Some people say, oh, well, sometimes coordination is hard. And those are both true. But it turns out that actually at a subconscious level, this happens. And the best example, I think, is when it comes to brainstorming ideas. Study after study show that we're dumb if we do regular brainstorming sessions where everyone gets in a group and we go around and say any idea is a good idea, because the research is just incredibly clear. Groups of people that do that will come up with fewer ideas and not as many good ideas as people will on their own if they brainstorm themselves and then just combine their lists. So there's a lot of kind of depressing statistics around that. That said, there are kind of the opposites too. There are ways to do things like brainstorming where a group of people actually will come up with better ideas than just one person. But it's not the way we normally operate. And some of it's counterintuitive. So yes, on balance, you're better off per capita working by yourself. But the greatest potential that you can have is going to be with other people. It's just most of the time we don't achieve that promise.
Mm-hmm. I relate to what you said about writing, because my latest book, The Heart to Start, I was going to maybe hire an editor, but then I decided I don't think I can afford to hire an editor. And, it'd be nice to see what people think of the book anyway. So I just put out a Google Doc, let people comment on it. And it turned out really great to get comments and perspectives from a lot of different people. I think it made the book so much better because of that.
I love that.
So that's interesting. So then you just to have a successful team, then you just get a lot of diversity. You get people together, and then that's that, right? Or what does it take?
There's a lot more than that. I mean, if it was that simple, then corporate America would be great. Congress would be doing well. There's a lot of things that would be different if that's all it was. Getting people who think different and put them in a room and let them make laws. What could that doesn't go wrong ever. So there's a lot more to it than that. And in the book, I go through kind of this setting the foundation of, that initial argument that I just said. 2 heads are only better than one if they think differently. You'll never be smarter than the smartest person unless you have kind of different ways of looking at things. But then what? Because it doesn't always go well. In fact, it usually doesn't go that well. I have this kind of theory that I call the zone of optimal friction, which is basically that in between 2 very different ways of seeing something or 2 very different ideas is this kind of zone of tension. It's like whenever we're working with people who are different, or who push us in some way, it's like we're stretching a rubber band out from a bunch of different sides. And we're all afraid of the part where the rubber band stretches too far and it snaps and everyone gets hurt. And so because of that, a lot of groups will kind of avoid the tension. They'll avoid the friction. And so this is what leads to what happens in a lot of companies and a lot of people who are trying to get along, is in our effort to not, destroy ourselves or destroy each other, we kind of hold back psychologically or subconsciously or even deliberately. We say, I'm not going to speak up because that is going to be risky to my status in the group. So if you can, as a contributor or as a leader, or say you're a solopreneur or you're a writer working on something by yourself, if you can figure out ways to kind of push what you're working on and the way that you're thinking into that zone of cognitive friction, then that's where the magic happens. And then on the other side of it, being able to pull things off of the cliff edge, so to speak, when they get too heated or when they get personal, for example. So kind of staying in that zone is the goal. And you get there with different people, and you get there with different ways of stoking friction and stabilizing too much of it. But that's kind of the game. And then the question then becomes, well, how do you do that? And that's where I spend a lot of the rest of the book, kind of the 3/4 of the book, exploring different ways this happens in history, different ways of thinking about this, and how all of our kind of common, I would call them myths, but our common wisdom around teamwork isn't necessarily what it seems, and how we should rethink some of that.
And so You were saying that this was kind of an extension of SmartCuts, which I think is really about kind of getting somewhere fast, like really accelerating your career, which is something I think that you've done in journalism, becoming a Wired writer very, very quickly. It's something that you've done with your company Contently. You've raised $20 million and built a team, and you've been around for, I think, 7 years now, that company. Where does, I don't know, it sounds like maybe, so how is Dream Teams an extension of SmartCuts then? So
SmartCuts, both of these books were happening while I was running this company, and kind of an outgrowth of my journalism work in business and science and technology itself. So while I was running the company, I'm not doing it full time anymore. I'm just kind of partially involved. There's a team that now is managing this phase better than I would myself. But when I was there, my job started out as the leader who had to both build things and also figure out how we were going to change the world and how we were going to be innovative, how we were going to break through. And you're working in a startup environment, and you're in New York too, where it's like you burn through money so fast, especially with the team and stuff. So you have to really reach certain levels at a certain point. Was that part of the pressure? Part of it was, yeah. How do we get to where we want to go quickly? How do we do this in a way that no one's done before? Yeah, and while keeping the business afloat, while not running out of money, and all those pressures, and just seeing that there's so many examples of of companies that have built incredible things very, very quickly. And the way that happens is kind of like I said in the beginning, not when you do the same thing everyone else does. It's when you think laterally and you change the game. And so, I started writing about companies first that were doing this sort of thing in order to learn lessons from my company. And then that kind of expanded to more than just businesses, certainly more than technology businesses. And I looked at, championship surfers and people who are in entertainment and, people who started movements and YouTube stars and those kinds of things, because I saw that same pattern in all of that. And so my role went from being the hill finder, I guess, at Contently, to the kind of the team, I don't know the right word, referee, the team builder and the referee, at a certain point where I found that my job was no longer to create marketing campaigns or to, in the early days, we all wrote code when there were only 3 of us. My job wasn't to do that. And we were on a pretty good path. There's adaptation that we needed to make, but we had a vision, we had a purpose, and we had a strategy that was working. So we needed to scale. So I needed to hire people and help them do their best work. And I started fretting about just, the complexity of that and how difficult it is to find the right people, the anxiety you have around, do we have the right people? And are we building the right environment where people can thrive? And then what do you do when people disagree? What do you do when someone doesn't fit your expectation of who works with you? And what do you do when people have different opinions on things and both are valid? And what do you do when things get personal between really, really smart and valuable people? So I started thinking about all of those, and I said, well, it's time for another adventure into journalism. Let me interview people who have built great cultures of their companies. Let me interview people who have been captains of cool teams. And then that started me down this rabbit hole where I realized, this is another book. This isn't just about, once again, technology companies like mine. This is about humanity. And this is something that's been going on since, we were fighting wars with sticks to, today when we're fighting wars with, missiles, and every sort of size of group between, a partnership or a marriage and, a society all has the same kind of challenge of making progress, breaking through, not getting stuck, not being surpassed by the changing environment or destroyed by it. And so how do we move forward together? We need each other. But it's hard. And so that I kind of became this obsession for a while. And I was actually thinking about it while I was finishing up SmartCuts. And it, as my role was changing, it kind of metastasized from there.
When you make this realization that, here's something that I'm interested in learning more about, is like, how does a diverse team get together and have productive conflict? How how does that, you say that you go and you start looking for people who have been a part of teams that have gone well. Like, what was your first step in that process?
There's a couple of things. One is that I really love exploring. And I think intellectually and I guess physically, one of my hobbies is urban exploring. I like to, see the abandoned building and figure out how to get into it. I like to go into the sewer. I like to climb a bridge. I sound like a crazy person right now, but I really like exploring. And so same thing.
I'm loving it.
Same thing with, with topics I'm interested in. I'll spend hours on Wikipedia or Reddit or whatever it is, just digging into a topic that I am interested in. And lots of people do this, right? But I think the thing that I do differently if there's talent that I have, it's for getting people to talk to me, for drumming up interviews. So I'll read this, everything I can, on the internet. I'll buy books and I'll look for patterns and I'll, find the questions that I have that I can't find from these available sources. And then I'm pretty good at cold calling or cold emailing people and talking them into letting me record a conversation so that I can get deeper in the topic, so I can become more expert, or so I can continue that kind of pattern recognition. So, and I use journalism as the excuse. It's a lot easier to call someone up and say, "Hey, I'm writing an article for Fast Company. Can I talk to you about this?" And then you write the article, but you also, during that conversation, you're asking them things that you're interested about as well, whether you end up writing about them or not. Sometimes the articles are really on point, and sometimes, I spend 10 minutes talking to them about the other thing I want to talk about. But also, even if you write for magazines, it's hard to get some people to talk to you. So being able to work on that and kind of wiggle your way to the right people, that's something they teach you in journalism school. It's something you learn in a newsroom. But I've had really good success of using that as a way to just learn myself. And it often does come back around and end up in something like a book.
And I assume that aside from this Dream Teams topic, there's probably plenty of other topics that you're sort of dabbling in and exploring a little bit, but that don't necessarily result in a book. Is that true?
It is. However, I think that and one of the things that I write about in Dream Teams, you can find analogies and kind of cross practices rather than best practices in a lot of different fields and import them into your own field. So, I write for GQ, and very little of what I'll end up writing for GQ will ever have to do with, a startup company. Probably won't have to do with, I could write a sports story that has to do with teams, but, for GQ, I'm writing about brain helmets and ice cream and rappers and comedians and stuff. But it turns out that things that people will say in these conversations or things that I'll explore in these different veins often come back around, and I can incorporate them as analogies into whatever I'm working on. The other thing too is it kind of raises I wrote this ice cream story for GQ a couple of years ago that was super popular. Never had to do with anything, but through it, I got to meet some people that have ended up being helpful in other avenues. But also, I got a lot of people paying attention to my work. If you pay attention to me, if you start following me because I wrote this funny ice cream story, and then I present to you a question about teamwork, and you answer that ice cream story just helped me on my journey towards Dream Teams. So I think that we underestimate how valuable exploring is. Even if you're only spending a little percentage of your time doing it, it's not necessarily all just for fun. Having fun can, if you're paying attention, if you're noticing things, it can help you change the way that you think about whatever else you're working on.
And so when you first started writing Dream Teams, was it truly about Dream Teams or was it that you got fascinated by other things and that led to this fascination about Dream Teams?
So it's, the quote about how the statue of David was he carved the block and it
just
became
removed,
and he found the statue.
David, yeah.
Exactly. He started carving and then he found it rather than he created it. It feels a little bit like that, only, the wrong metaphor, like a much crappier statue. Imagine that in this analogy. But what it was, the thing that I was fascinated about was this idea. And initially I wanted to write at least an article series about this outsider effect. The effect that happens when an outsider enters a new industry, or you bring outside knowledge from one industry to another, and kind of importing ideas from one place to another. The toy designer that gets a microbiology degree and then realizes, I can apply some of these things about molecules to toy design, that sort of thing. So I became kind of obsessed with that, and then, sort of zoomed around and came across all of this research about cognitive diversity and perspectives and heuristics and predictive models, and how that works. And it turns out that the outsider thing is really about importing different ways of thinking. And so I started framing kind of my search around that. Then I got obsessed for a while with, and this almost became the book, and it would be a very different book. I got obsessed with the fact that my father worked in nuclear engineering growing up in the middle of the Idaho desert at this nuclear test facility. And I remember touring the facility and, talking science with my dad, and growing up with this story about how all these scientists put their heads together, and no matter what country they were from and who they were, and they came together, and that's how we developed this groundbreaking technology that only emits steam and this like stinky material that we put in canisters and is completely safe. And that's going to change the world. No more burning coal. And my dad, he talked about this all the time, how nuclear was the thing that was going to help change the world with cheaper, cleaner energy. And it was a few years ago that I realized that it's more complicated than that. But yes, and also that same technology that all those scientists put their heads together, that my dad worked on, that put food on our table growing up, is the number one most likely thing that will end all of mankind. And that's pretty sobering, and it kind of sucks. And it's an obvious thing, but the idea that any tool we make can be used for good or evil, and the more powerful the tools we make, the more scary it is that they get used for evil. And so I ended up wanting to write about that idea, and I started exploring that quite a bit, this kind of paradox. And then I realized that these two things were kind of connected, that humans putting their heads together to develop this technology that when other humans put their heads together, they want to use on each other to kill each other. That's kind of the analogy for all of human history, that we have this power when combined to make great things, but we have this tendency when combined to want to kill each other. And then I realized that this outsider thing, the perspectives, bringing something different to somewhere that it's foreign to, was kind of the catalyst for both things. So it's sort of this, wrapping my arms around this. And then from there, it was like, well, do I write a book about, saving the world from our nuclear destruction? And do I use that as an avenue to talk about, this psychology and perspectives, or what? And eventually that whittled down to, the more inspiring lens on that is an examination of incredible teams in history, people that defy the odds, that did these incredible things and didn't want to kill each other, and what we can learn about them, and using that as the avenue for exploring the psychology of what makes the difference, and how we can kind of the subtle self-help in disguise that can be wrapped into this, of how we can make our teams better, how we can be better collaborators, more creative together, and all of that. So that's roughly how it took shape. And it was not a fast process. And I think that's important, actually. I think that I'm less hasty in the conclusions in this piece of writing than I have in a lot of my past writing.
Mm-hmm. And I heard you were on Altucher's podcast, and you were talking about it was the working title was The Power of Difference.
Yep.
So I can see kind of where maybe some of that came from, was that you were interested in how these sort of conflicting forces might come together to make something interesting.
Exactly.
But then, of course, it became dream teams. And to me, I'm thinking just as a book writer and a book marketer, I'm like, oh yeah, somebody obviously wants to buy the Dream Teams book more than they want to buy and read a book that's just like, oh, here's the power of difference.
Right.
How did that play out for you?
Yeah. So the power of difference was one. I have this spreadsheet. I don't really feel like I'm prepared to let the world see it. I'll let you see it, David. But I have this spreadsheet of like 1,000 book titles. That was this ongoing thing as my thought process was evolving. The spreadsheet was around for over a year. And that was kind of the best working title when the angle was was actually the nuclear angle, that our differences are what make us break through or make us want to destroy each other. And that's when I had started. I think when I went on Altucher's podcast, it's quite a while ago now. That's when I had started exploring this kind of dynamic, that paradox at different levels, different kinds of groups. But that was one where I'm really grateful to my editor. So I had a couple of editors. There's a lot of people that collaborated on this process. And then like you, I kind of opened up to strangers on the internet to help me with kind of the culling of ideas and all of that. But my editor made the same point that you did. It just hadn't occurred to me. I was upset. I was like, differences are such an interesting, juicy, powerful concept, kind of, leads to some controversial conversations, which is interesting to me. But she pointed out that if you're buying a book, I need to get in the head of the people who are buying books. If you're buying a book, you're buying it for one of two reasons. Either you have a problem that you want to solve and you think this book can help you, or you want to be entertained, essentially. And you want to learn something new that's fun that you can talk about. And
look smart at cocktail parties. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you think about, that's what fiction is. That's what novels are. I think fiction has a lot of other value besides that, but you pick up a novel because you heard about it or it looks fun. And you pick up a business book or, a self-help book or a science book because you want to get better at something. You want to learn something that can solve a problem you have. And in either case, the power of differences just sounds like, oh, you're talking about a phenomenon that may or may not be fun. Probably doesn't sound that fun. Sounds, scary. And I don't know how this helps. And so then, we got into a lot of different ways of framing this. And actually, this is where I think thinking about marketing in mind and the audience and what the audience needs is very helpful to the writing process itself, because I changed a lot of the book and I ended up, I hadn't written much at this point, but actually down on paper, but I had collected a lot of stories and studies. And that's where we said, well, most people's problem with collaboration is they can't get work done, or they're out of ideas, they're stuck, or their team is fighting. And so, this idea that being able to work together without falling apart is pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a problem.
To get something.
Yeah. But then, framing it as that's not all we want to do. It's kind of depressing to say like, here's a book about not sucking is bad, which is a goal. It is a problem. But, the other side of it is just this amazing promise. A dream is to be the kind of team that's infinite, that does change your world, right? That does do the incredible. And so that's why the book is Dream Teams Working Together Without Falling Apart.
We're going to take a quick break. I'm really excited to have Skillshare back on the show as a sponsor of Love Your Work. I know that you will love Skillshare because you're a Love Your Work listener, and Love Your Work listeners naturally love to learn. And if you aren't familiar with Skillshare, it is an online learning platform with over 18,000 classes in business, marketing, entrepreneurship, technology, and more. They have everything. A class that I personally really enjoyed is called The Writer's Toolkit, 6 Steps to a Successful Writing Habit. It is by author and screenwriter Simon Van Boy, and it will help you get into the writer's mindset.
So be prepared for chaos. Be prepared for a constant sense of failure. And that's what really, really makes you a writer.
Join the millions of students already on Skillshare today with a special offer just for my listeners. Get 2 months of Skillshare for just 99 cents. 99 cents. You can't even buy a decent pen for that price. Anyway, that is right. Skillshare is offering Love Your Work listeners 2 months of unlimited access to over 18,000 classes for just 99 cents. To sign up, go to Skillshare.com/loveyourwork. Again, go to Skillshare.com/loveyourwork to start your 2 months now. If you're a creative entrepreneur, you need more than just a beautiful website. You need a powerful website. Success isn't just getting your products online. It's getting your products into the hands of the customers who will love them. I'm honored to have Weebly sponsoring Love Your Work. With Weebly, you don't just get an easy-to-build website with great-looking templates. And by the way, as a designer, I have to say, Weebly's templates are stunning. With Weebly, your website is not just beautiful. You also get tons of tools to help you turn that website into a business. This means features to help promote your products, process payment, manage inventory, send marketing campaigns, and get discovered by new customers. Stuff that gets you paid. Stuff at the intersection of your love and money Venn diagram. Weebly is offering 15% off just for Love Your Work listeners at Weebly.com/loveyourwork. That's right. As a fan of Love Your Work, go to Weebly.com/loveyourwork. That's Weebly, WEEBLY.com/loveyourwork. And you'll get 15% off when you sign up for your online store. Weebly, more than just a beautiful website. I love thinking about the psychology behind book titles and book marketing. I came across something kind of similar as I was trying to find my voice as a writer. I was initially writing a book that was kind of had like a digital distraction thing to it. It was like, yeah, here's what companies are doing to distract us, and here's what you can do to fight back, etc. And a lot of the response that I got from people who knew books that was very valuable was like, you can definitely get people to click on an article about that, but when it comes time for them to take money out of their pocket and buy something, that's not what they want so much. So I've been more on like the creativity self-help genre, which I'm really glad that I found, because I do really think that if somebody is trying to make it with their creative work, that in itself is this automatic antidote to being distracted, because suddenly there's this goal that you want to achieve. There's this thing you want to do, and that motivates you to become the person that you want to be.
I love that.
Yeah. So and that's really interesting. Also, I admire the fact that you were able to go onto Altucher's podcast and talk about openly that this is a working title, and just go ahead and talk about it and put that information out there. I feel like a lot of authors would say like, oh no, I can't, I'm not ready. I've got to stay in my cave and make sure that everything's perfect. But you put it out there. And this kind of ties into what you're talking about in Dream Teams, that you were able to put your stuff out there, and maybe you got some feedback from that process or something. I don't know. Does it feed into what you were talking about in Dream Teams in any ways?
It does. Yeah. I think on the one hand, I don't have the confidence to be able to just store something up and put it out and think that it's going to be perfect. I think I've learned my lesson doing that a few too many times as a youth, as they say. So there's that. The other is, I like thinking of my role as a writer, as an explorer, just like I love exploring physical spaces. And if you frame it like that, to me, it helps me to be less attached to my ego, and it makes it okay to change or to be wrong about something. And then it makes it okay to workshop in front of people. One of my favorite things I've ever read in my life is the autobiography of Ben Franklin. And in that, he talks about how he likes to start conversations about things he's opinionated about by saying, I could be wrong, and then saying whatever it is he has to say. And even though he thinks he's right, just by starting that way, it depressurizes it for him. So if he's proven wrong, he doesn't feel bad. He can actually change his mind. But also it makes it okay to talk about something, and people don't judge you as much for being wrong, because you're clearly open to adapting and exploring. I think it'll be a long time before I'm able to write a book about I'm really good at business, and here's what I've learned and how you can too. Much more comfortable writing the book about I'm exploring this thing and here's what I'm finding, and I've made some conclusions. What do you think? And I think that halfway through the book writing process, going on a podcast and talking about what I've got so far, even though it might be subject to change, is useful. And I did get a lot of feedback, both from James and from listeners, that I think was very helpful.
Yeah, that's something that I've been talking about a lot on this podcast, is the idea of the process kind of being the product. That, I have these conversations on the podcast. I publish them to people. And when I'm having this conversation, I'm curious. I want to know things about Shane. And then I have this conversation that makes me think about, I read your book that makes me think about things. I have the conversation, then maybe I write stuff on Medium. And then it starts to build up into this worldview that then eventually some somewhat polished product comes out, and people think like, oh, wow, you really did a good job with this. You really planned this out, et cetera. And it's like, I don't actually know what I'm doing. I'm just doing the stuff and exploring and putting it out there. And in that process, it makes things kind of come out more polished. Does that resonate at all with your process?
Absolutely. Earlier today, I went and I did a a lunch session with one of my favorite companies in New York. Actually, the only PR agency that I can say I love. There's a lot of good people working in PR. There's a lot of frustrating people in PR. But this agency is one that I truly love, that I've worked with for a long time. And I went and did a lunch session and kind of road tested my keynote speech for one of my keynote speeches that I'm planning on doing on my book tour for this book. And it was cool because I was testing some of the ways of framing this in a keynote, and the questions that they ask. It was great because there was a point where Sloan, the woman who runs the company, she said, "Shane, you're like a library. How do you know all of this stuff? You know all this stuff in all these different veins, and you're connecting all these studies that I would have never thought to connect." I was like, 3 of those things that I just talked about, I had just connected now by opening my mouth in this thing because, your girl asked this question about, whatever it was. And so it's kind of this continual co-creation process, which I really like. I think that, years of working and studying and exploring and researching, it often comes together when you have, an excuse like a writing project or a speech, or when someone asks that key question. The question that Sloan's employee asked was something like, do you think that we need people who are insane? Because if we don't have those kinds of people who are exploring beyond the boundaries of what we think is okay, or who are just out there beyond those boundaries, that we'll never think of things that'll sort of change the world or whatever. I'm like, that's a really interesting question. Because we talk about how genius and insanity often look very similar until, it bears out that the genius, made relativity and the insane person went to the hospital. And we talk about that sort of thing. But the way that she framed the question, I was like, there's these 2 studies that I read recently that, that kind of speak to this. And then that connects to this other study that they did back in the 90s. And we had this great discussion about it. And, that wouldn't have come up if I was just on my own. So I think I've already kind of lost the thread of where that question started, but what you're saying really resonates because this is kind of how my process works.
It's funny. This is one of these things that I wish somebody would have taught me or told me about being a writer, was that I was for so long so fascinated by writers like Malcolm Gladwell or Seth Godin and hearing their stories. And, I read your book, Dream Teams, and there's all these wonderful stories in there to support everything. And I'm thinking, well, how do you find the right story to support these things? But what I've personally found myself as a writer is that it doesn't work like that. It's not like I'm trying to find a story to fit this problem. Sometimes I do, but mostly it's just exploring a lot of stuff and collecting a lot of information in some kind of a capture system. Part of that capture system being my own brain. And then eventually you just are able to connect these things. Is that how it works for you? How do you manage all these stories and anecdotes?
Yeah, in the past, I think I would try really hard I had a concept that I wanted to write about, or I'd found some study that seemed cool, or I had a theory. More often than not, I have a theory. This is how the world works. Let me find a story that perfectly illustrates this. And I think that's interesting, but it's a less mature way to go about it. My preference now is let me explore a lot of things. Let me dig into some stories. And then let me find the pattern inside those. And then when I'm ready to talk about the pattern or to teach the pattern, I'll just take one of those stories that I already explored. So it's not kind of like fitting. I've been accused of this in the past, enough years ago now that I can admit that they were right. But I've been accused of, I was accused maybe 5 years ago of shooting the barn, which is when you shoot the barn and then you draw a target around where you shot. And it's very easy to do that. And I think there's a lot of
people also call it cherry picking, I think. Right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's an easy way to go about it. And sometimes it's really compelling. I mean, stories are amazing. If you can do that, then you can get people to be like, wow. I think that this time around, and the last few writing projects I've done, over say the last 4 years, have been a lot more, I've just done so much more exploring and thinking and researching before I got to the writing part that I didn't have to shoot the barn in any way. We'll see. I'm sure I'm wrong about some conclusions I draw in this book, and that'll bear out over time, and that's okay. But I think directionally, the stories that are in the book are, for example, the first chapter after the prologue is about cops and detectives and kind of really interesting teams in history that solve mysteries or prevented assassinations. And that wasn't, okay, well, I have this theory about whatever, let me find a cop team. That was because I went down a rabbit hole for 4 months interviewing FBI agents and learning about, private detectives history and, detectives during the Civil War and spies and things. And I found some amazing stories that it turned out there was research kind of buried inside. So I like that process more. It takes more time, but I think it's important. One thing I could say on that it could be sort of an actionable lesson for anyone who's listening, who's a creative person. There's a very interesting pattern when you see people who are the very best in a creative field. They spend a lot more time than you think taking in content. So my favorite example is the guy who runs content at Netflix. Is the guy that helped them build the algorithm that recommends stuff, and the guy that is over new series. He spends a third of his week watching television. And he spent his whole teenage years watching every movie in the movie store. Because he was the clerk at the movie store, watching every movie so that he could recommend movies to people. People who get to that level of being so smart at trends in movies and TV shows and what should be made next, making those big bets, you better believe that those people watch more than people who make worse bets. And so I think that's, for me as a writer, I want to be a better writer. As a storyteller, I want to tell better stories. I need to learn more stories. I need to read more. I need to dig into more. And I would say that people like Malcolm Gladwell probably are more well-read than you think.
I mean, I've heard him talk about just spending hours in microfiche, just kind of wandering around looking for the right thing. And what you're describing is sort of this idea of becoming a connoisseur. I can think of Cards Against Humanity. We had one of their founders on, and there was this team of 8 kids that were kind of nerdy kids, and they played so many board games that they couldn't even play Balderdash anymore because they knew all the words in the game. And so they knew games so well. And when it came time for them to make their own game, they needed to make their own game because they couldn't play any other games. So when it came time to make their own game, they really knew the ins and outs of everything.
I love that.
Do you have any sort of a capture system or way that you retain this knowledge or organize this knowledge? I know Ryan Holiday has his commonplace book of index cards. I personally love my Kindle highlights and using Readwise to send them back to me every day via email and sharing them out via Twitter and stuff. Do you have a way that you manage all this knowledge and these stories?
Well, first of all, I'm really interested in copying your Kindle Readwise thing. That's awesome. So my main method is Evernote. So Evernote has a little web clipper tool in Chrome. So when I find an article that's interesting, I can hit the Evernote button and it'll save it in Evernote. And you can save it as the whole web page or a simplified version or just a snippet of it. You can save PDFs that way. So I kind of just use Evernote as my kind of the database storage system. And I'll use... I do a lot of interviews.
Wait, what do you name the notebook in Evernote? Do you have a notebook specifically for this stuff? And what's your tagging operation look like?
Let me open Evernote right now and tell you. It is open. Okay. So my notebooks.
When would it not be open?
Right. My notebooks, I have an articles and blogs stack, and that has Fast Company, GQ, New Yorker, Wired, and then an ideas stack. So just a notebook with, or an ideas notebook. So there's a notebook of different notes for just the random stuff. And then I have posts for my own, what I call the snow report. I have a Contently notebook stack, this company stuff. And then each of my books, through them now.
So when you see an article or story that you really like, which notebook does it go into?
So if it's something that has to do with something I'm writing, I'll stick it in that notebook. If it's not, then I have a general research and notes, which I periodically go through, and I will synthesize stuff notes inside the general research and notes thing and stick it in or tag it in the different other stacks. So, I have, let's see what's in general research and notes right now.
What about books? I find I do so little reading online. Almost all my reading is books. What do you do when you read something in a book and you feel like it applies to something?
Yeah, so this is where my process, I think, is a little silly. So I do Kindle highlights. If I have a physical book, then I will take pictures of it and put in Evernote. The Kindle highlights, generally what I'll do is I will copy all the highlights for one book and stick it in an Evernote note. So then it's all searchable from the same thing. There's a lot of, I take a lot of photos of things, and basically Evernote is my capture when I do audio recordings. So say this was an interview with you and I was talking to you about, design and procrastination and those kinds of things. Then I would be recording the call using what's an app called Automatic Call Recorder in Android, and to get your permission first. But I get your permission, I do that. And then that gets sent to rev.com. And then when that transcript, and it automatically transcribes it, someone does. And then that automatically gets put into a Word doc that gets automatically shared in my Evernote again. So it all kind of comes back to there. And it's a little bit messy, the Evernote itself, but they have such a great search and tagging tool that even stuff that gets categorized wrong, I end up finding, and then I resort.
I never even thought of this idea of just take a picture and put it in Evernote when you see something in a paper book.
Yeah, it's fun. I like paper books too. I like marking them up. I like having them around, but I like not, losing the information. And you can actually, if you take a clear enough picture, then the text can actually be searchable, which is nice.
Yes. Yeah, this is one of the things about when I moved to Colombia and it became more difficult for me to get paper books. I really lamented the fact that I was going to have to read everything on Kindle. But it's turned out to be just one of the best things I've ever done. I've got 8,000 Kindle highlights. I have a color-coded system because I do all my reading on iPad. There's color-coded highlights. Like I said, Readwise, they've been a sponsor on the show actually before. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but they send you just randomly a collection of your highlights every day.
That's cool.
And then what I'll go do is I'll go on Readwise, especially after I write a book or maybe even a book I read years ago, and I'll just sit and go through highlights and share on Twitter the ones that I think are cool or interesting. And then from that, I've found, some of those highlights people will really just get excited about, or they'll get retweeted or liked a lot. And then from that, I can, if it's somebody I'm going to speak to on the podcast, I can then make sure we talk about that topic, or I can use those topics and then turn them into blog posts that I write about those things. So anyway, that's a little bit how my process works. You said that it sounded like you were interested in the Readwise process that I use. So
yeah, well, just using your Kindle highlights, having a mechanism to turn your Kindle highlights into social content. And then also reminding yourself of what you've read. I love that.
Yeah, the reviewing is so important, I think. It's so easy. There's so many books that you want to read. It's so easy to, okay, I'm done with this book. I want to get on to the next one. But
right.
I find it just works so much better if you take some time to review. And then also Readwise makes it so that you get a little bit of a review here and there.
I'm curious, if you don't mind me asking you a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
What book have you highlighted the most, or what's the most Readwised back to you?
Let's see. I'm actually going to go check my Readwise right now, and hopefully it won't take me too long to get to it. My most highlighted book, I'm surprised by this because there's not a lot of very tweetable elements, is Anti-Fragile by Taleb.
Yeah, that's a great book. It's written very interestingly too. It's kind of a lot of, I don't know, like proverbs in there almost.
Yeah, there's not like a lot of like pithy statements that you can just tweet out and that people are going to resonate with. The other one is, and this is actually a topic that I wanted to bring up earlier when we were talking about process, is Old Masters and Young Geniuses by David Gallinson. And you might have come across his work. Malcolm Gladwell cited it in one of his podcast episodes. He's an economist that I've had on the show before, who basically found two different patterns of painters. So there's the conceptual creators and there's the experimental creators. So Picasso would be a conceptual creator, which is just you have a concept, you execute it. Warhol would be the ultimate conceptual creator. He didn't even actually create a lot of his work. It was just a concept. But then the ultimate experimental creator that he mentions is Cezanne. And Cezanne was always painting to explore. Like his paintings, he wasn't painting to make a painting. He was painting to discover a thing. And then you see, the experimental creators such as Cezanne, their paintings get more and more valuable as they get older. And then the conceptual creators like Picasso, it's the earlier Picassos that are really valuable. So that's how the economics works. But I have to say, even though when I interviewed David, he seemed to be resistant to the idea that a person could switch between conceptual and experimental. I found it very powerful to accept myself as an experimental creator, even though there's maybe some conceptual in there. I found it helpful to accept myself as an experimental creator because then that made it comfortable for me to see my process as a product in itself, which I think might be a little bit of what goes on with you. Like when you were on Altiture's podcast and like you're saying these things and then you're like, oh, that's an interesting idea. I'll have to explore that. But the fact that you're giving yourself permission to put your process out there as something to be consumed helps your final product, which ties into the Dream Team thing.
Interesting way of framing it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think I've come across that book. I think I might have referenced something in it a long time ago in an article that I've written a few times about, the ages that people do different kinds of work. And actually I remember what it was about. Is about the idea of cognitive entrenchment, that the longer you do something, the more you get good at it, the more likely you are to basically get stuck in a certain way of seeing it. And
be resistant to different perspectives. Yeah.
Yep. And then fighting that is good. And once you know that that's the thing that can happen, then you can kind of shore yourself up against that by bringing in outside perspectives and, having the humility to listen and all that. That was a few years ago. That was early on in the study that became Dream Teams. But I like that. I like that, I guess, dichotomy. I would also question whether, whether people are one or the other, and if they can't put themselves in different modes.
Yeah.
But seeing it that way and knowing when you're in one mode and when you're not is probably very valuable.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful to think of it that way, and maybe I'll explore that a little bit because I was thinking, maybe I'm totally an experimental creator. And then when I look, though, if I look for evidence against that, then I start to wonder. So it does seem like if you can put on those different hats, it might be valuable. So
yeah, at least worth seeing.
So we are about at the end of our time. Do you have, based on we've talked about so many different things, and do you have a final message that would tie together our conversation with a bow today?
When we were talking about taking in, becoming connoisseur, right? And we were talking about, Gladwell being, on the microfilm, just reading about random things for ever and ever. I think that there's this interesting thing. When I wrote about Smart Cuts, I was largely, I think the takeaway that a lot of people got was how to get to where I want to go faster, how to find a better path to, building something, changing something, being, innovative, whatever it is. And I think the way that connects to this connoisseur idea and this thing that I've been talking about getting lots of inputs and seeking diversity of perspectives and all of that, is that if you become very, very well sort of researched or well read or whatever it is in your industry, there's a tipping point where you go from curious to expert to practitioner to connoisseur, and when you get to that connoisseur point, suddenly everything becomes much, much more powerful and much easier. And in Smart Cuts, I wrote about some examples of people who seem to be overnight successes. And that's what we all want to be. We all want to get to the top faster. We all want to, achieve what we want faster. We're impatient. And I think that's cool. But often when you peel back those overnight successes, you see that they're 10 years in the making. And I think that should give us heart, but it should also give us a little bit of a roadmap that there's not an easy way to changing our world. It may appear fast on the surface. There may be a better way to do it, but it requires us to study and it requires us to explore. And that at a certain point, all that studying, all that exploring will tip us over into a really awesome place.
Yeah, I love that. That's something that I feel like I've seen a number of times where I felt myself, where I'm really deep in a subject and I'm totally lost maybe. And then there's just this moment where everything connects and there's this inflection point. And you can see it happen with creators as well, when they have that overnight success, where all of a sudden everything just kind of clicks. So I would recommend everybody go check out Dream Teams. I think you can pre-order at the time that this interview comes out. Go check that out. Anywhere else you'd like for people to find you, Shane?
Just my website, shanesnow.com, kind of gets you anything, including being able to contact me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Shane.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Is Love Your Work helping you find the intersection on your love and money Venn diagram? Does it bring you the inspiration and motivation to make you into the person that you want to be? If so, we, together, you and I, can make this the show that we want it to be. I'm trying to make a nourishing and thoughtful show, and I could use your help with that. Please donate to the show. Just a coffee a month will help support the hosting and production of this show. Just a coffee a month will help spread Love Your Work's message, helping more people live a balanced life with a healthy definition of success. To donate, visit our Patreon page at kadavy.net/donate. Patreon is a platform that lets you support creators like me. Vote with your dollars and keep Love Your Work going at kadavy.net/donate. As a thank you, you'll get early access, bonus content, and a discount on Love Your Work merchandise. Learn more at kadavy.net/donate. That's kadavy.net/donate. Love Your Work is brought to you in part by our Patreon supporters, such as mini sponsor Roxana Maynard of Agility Alchemist at agilityalchemist.com, and top supporters such as Arif Akhtar and Jeffrey Mason. This has been Love Your Work, and I'm David Kadavy. The theme music for this show is At Sea by Dorena from the album About Everything and More, by arrangement with Deep Elm Records at deepelm.com. Love Your Work is a production of Kadavy Inc.